Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Nice to see y'all. Thanks for joining. Thanks for being here. And excited to learn with y'all today. Before I begin, are there any lingering questions from last week? I know we kind of covered a lot of background information. Was there anything that y'all were like, oh, I really wanted to know this, but I didn't get a chance to ask? Cool. I love it when I explain things so perfectly that nobody has questions. And great.
Oh, we don't remember what we don't remember.
Okay. Reality sets in. That's fine. So we're going to, look, I think part of the way we can really learn about, I tried to do a lot of the history and background last week, but I think really the way to learn about Hasidic thought is to learn Hasidic thought. So we're going to do that today. We're going to learn from one of my favorite rebbes, Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Just as a little bit of background, Reb Levi Yitzchak was unique in a few different ways. One, he was a student of the Maggid of Mezrich, who again, so went the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Mezrich, and then Reb Levi Yitzchak was one of the Maggid students. And Reb Levi Yitzchak is one of the key figures in the spread of Hasidism, and is one of the reasons why it spreads as successfully as it did, because he was very charismatic and very spiritual, and somewhat uniquely was very well versed in halachic thought, and was actually the ruling halachic authority in the region for his duration of his time. So people would, in addition to being the Hasidic Rebbe, they would also come to him with halachic questions and became a little bit of a model. But he is also known as the lover of Israel, because a lot of his teachings really focus on defending Israel against their accusations. Maybe not so much this one, but we'll see it. We'll come back to him a lot because I'm biased and I really like him. So a very short story. In graduate school, I took a class on Midrash, and the professor who was rabbi/professor who was teaching it is like, so why did we're going to learn Pirkei to Rabbi Eliezer. Why are we going to learn Pirkei to Rabbi Eliezer? Because I've always wanted to learn it and I never have. So we're going to learn that. So I decided that's what we're going to learn. So, why are we going to learn Reb Levi Yitzchak? Because I really like Reb Levi Yitzchak, and that's what we're going to learn. So a little bit of a teacher bias going on, but I hope you don't mind.
Let me understand the succession. He was the student of the Baal Shem Tov.
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
A lot of times they'll term it in terms of generations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always generations from the Baal Shem Tov. So he's a third generation Rebbe. When we learn Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, one of the key figures in Chabad Lubavitch, I believe, if I remember correctly, he's a fourth generation. So he was a generation behind. But then it gets confusing because, they'll also sometimes count generations from the founding of that branch. So Reb Levi Yitzchak is the third generation Hasidic Rebbe, but he is the first generation of that Hasidic line. So like Reb Shneur Zalman is... one second. Sorry, somebody just walked into my office and started talking about the mezuzah, and I'm like, excuse me, like, kind of sitting in here. So, like, Reb Shneur Zalman, I believe, was first generation of Chabad. I have to double check my numbers, so don't quote me. But Rabbi Schneerson, who we talked about, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, was like a seventh generation, but seventh generation Chabad. Lubavitch, because he was like the seventh in line, like the seventh down the line. So it kind of varies, and generations can overlap, because if somebody was a Rebbe for 50 years, but someone else had like multiple Rebbes in that time, you could have like a third generation and like a fourth generation at the same time in different places. So just letting you, that's kind of how they count. But yes, he is counted as third generation, but first generation of the Berdichev dynasty. So here, let me pull up the screen. Most commonly, this one's a little bit of a short one. Can you guys see it okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of times this will fit, is that they're going to start first with a verse from the Torah, because that way you know what verse they're talking about. And then they will continue with a question. So if somebody wants to read, you can read kind of the verse and then the question that comes up after that.
I'll read.
Sure.
Noah was a righteous man, perfect in his generation.
Okay, great. Before we go on, just really quick, beautiful job. I just want to point out, does anything stand out to you about that verse?
He was righteous, but he was in his generation.
Good.
He was perfect.
Good. So this becomes a long-standing conversation, is in other situations when the Torah is talking about other characters, it'll say Ish Tzaddik or Ish Tamim, that he's righteous, he is perfect, he is great. But here it qualifies it, B'dorotav, in his generation. So why is it qualified in his generation? And this is a long-standing midrashic debate. There's some rabbis who make the argument that that he was righteous in his generation, and if he had been in any other generation with other righteous, he would have risen up to their level. So that he was righteous, but he was surrounded by a bunch of awful people. But he was the most righteous among them. But if he had lived in a different generation, then he would have elevated his righteousness to be among other righteous. There's kind of an interesting psychological, sociological thing going on there with, you kind of rise to the people, or you rise or lower yourself to the people who you're surrounded by. Yes.
Okay. Can you also look at it that, well, he was righteous in his generation because everybody else was so creepy, but in any other generation, he wouldn't have been considered righteous.
So good. That's the flip. That's the other argument about B'dorotav.
Okay.
That they use. Exactly. So one argument is that if whatever generation he would have been in, Noah would have elevated himself to the righteousness of that generation. He just happened to be in a bad generation, so it was kind of lower. But if he had been in a righteous generation, he would have risen to the top like all the other tzaddikim, the other righteous. On the flip, there's the argument that Noah was righteous for his generation, but in any other generation, not so much. He wouldn't have been considered quite as righteous in anybody else. That's the flip argument. I'm not going to say too much more because I don't want to spoil my sermon on Shabbat. But hey, Josh, nice to see you. Glad you're here. We just started, so you're not too far behind.
Oh, good. Sorry, I had meetings.
No worries. So Noah was righteous, perfect in his generation, but B'dorotav, whatever exactly that means, we have a little bit of a sense that it could go either way. Either he would have risen to the righteousness of everybody else, or he was righteous for his generation, but compared to other righteous, he was okay. He was all right. The story, a friend of mine was saying, he was talking to his mother, and his mother's like, why do you love this sibling? Why do you love that sibling? Like, oh, well, that one's the oldest. That one's the oldest son. That one's takes care of me. This one does this. And be like, well, what about this one? Like, what about the eldest sister? Like, Oh, her? Meh, she's okay. So it's kind of like Noah, if he, in any other generation, meh, he was okay. So that's the two. All right. So Cindy, go ahead, continue. Now we're going to get into Rashi's commentary on this.
In Rashi's commentary, he writes, Noah was included among those of small faith. How is this possible, since the Torah testifies that Noah was a righteous man, perfect in his generation?
Good. If you want the citation, if you're curious, Rashi's comment is on Genesis chapter 7, verse 7. If you ever want to look it up, I did to make sure I had the right citation to tell you where it was. But Rashi does not seem to be a huge Noah fan. Everybody familiar with Rashi? Let's kind of start there for me. Nodding. I see nodding. Okay. Then I won't go into Rashi. He says Noah is considered to be among those of small faith. So what's the question that Reb Levi Yitzchak's asking?
Well, is that the question that's right here where it says that the Torah says he was a righteous man, perfect in his generation? How is it possible that he was someone of small faith when the Torah says he was perfect in his generation and he was a
How
righteous
can
man?
Rashi say that about Noah? Like, if Noah was righteous and perfect in his generation, how can Rashi possibly say he was of small faith? How can the righteous be of small faith? That's the question that Reb Levi Yitzchak's going to ask. Everybody clear on the question? Okay. So how can he be righteous but still be of small faith? Now, I mentioned this last week, but it bears repeating probably a number of times. Is tzaddik in Hasidic thought is a code word. Tzaddik is usually used to refer to the Rebbe. So in this sense, it's not necessarily referring to tzaddik as like a righteous person, though that's usually how I'm going to end up interpreting it. But it's, if Noah was supposed to be the Rebbe of his generation, how can the Rebbe be of small faith? And how do you live as a leader of a community? How do you live as a leader of a religious community and lead them and guide them when you are lacking in faith yourself? That's kind of the question he's asking. Everybody good?
Are we going to find out why he says that?
Why does Rashi say that?
No, why does he say he's of small faith?
So you're not going to find out why Rashi says it. You're going to have to ask Rashi that question. So in many years,
I'll keep it in mind.
Many years, after 120 years of health and happiness and joy and good things, you ascend to the world to come, and you can go up and ask Rashi that question and see if you can send me a message back. If you get there before I do, send me a message back to let me know what he says. My suspicion, he's not going to explain why Rashi says that, but my suspicion is, I said there's two ways to look at this, at that word bedorotav. My suspicion is that Rashi is understanding Noah in the second way, that in his generation, Noah was great. In any other generation, he would have not been as righteous, or is considered, he would not have been considered a tzaddik compared to a generation full of tzaddikim. He's okay. That's my suspicion. Skimming a little bit of what Rashi says throughout his commentary there, that's kind of my impression, is that Rashi cites continuously both ideas, but I get the impression Rashi's leaning a little more towards that interpretation. Hey, Howard. Nice to see you.
So where did Rashi say the small faith thing?
Chapter 7, verse 7.
7:7.
I can pull it up for you if you're so inclined, if anybody
That's
wants to
okay.
see it. I think it's this one. So the verse itself, can you guys see that?
Mhm.
Okay, good. So it's highlighted. V'yavo Noach uvanav v'ishto shnei vanav ito el hateva mipnei mei hamablim. That Noah and his children and his wife and the wives of his children, they all came into the ark with him because of the waters of the flood. And Rashi has two comments on that verse. One is that the men and women entered separately because bad things are happening. So, need to distance ourselves from each other a little bit. We don't want, any attraction going on while everybody else is dying. That's the first comment. The second one is he believed, he says Noah was of those people who are wanting in faith. Noah was of, sorry, my eyes crossed. He believed and he did not believe that the flood would come and he would not enter the ark until the waters forced him to do so. So what's Rashi kind of saying there?
So he was kind of saying that he was hedging, like he didn't actually think this was going to happen. So he waited until the last possible second to go in.
Right. Well, she's like, am I going to doubt God that God's going to do as God said? No. If God says floods are going to come, the floods are going to come. But I'm not getting on the ark until they actually show up,
Right.
just in case.
Which, could just be simple pragmatism. I mean, who wants to be stuck in an ark with a whole barnyard full of animals until you have to?
I was going to say, I can't exactly blame him for not wanting to be on the ark with 2 cows, 2 hippos, 2 elephants, and so on.
Pretty small ark too.
One of my favorite, so the first piece of art my wife and I bought together, I actually thought about bringing it in and I forgot it at home. It's a kind of a cartoony picture of Noah's ark in the water, and it says Noah had a wooden boat, 2 termites, and a lot of faith. So it's currently up in our son's room. That was the first piece of art we bought together. So good. Questions so far, as we're coming back to the Hasidic. So that's kind of where he's pulling from, is that Rashi saying he was of small faith, fine, or of limited faith, however you want to translate it. So how can we say both? And so now we're going to get into the meat of it. Who wants to read next? We can explain.
Sorry, do what?
Go ahead, Josh.
We can explain this by stating there are 2 kinds of tzaddikim, righteous ones, who serve the Creator. There is one kind of tzaddik who serves the Creator and only has the urge to be a servant of the Creator, who believes that he has the power in the upper world to direct the worlds according to his will, as our rabbis have said, the tzaddik rules with fear of God. Who rules over me? The tzaddik. The holy blessing one decrees, and the tzaddik annuls the decree for good.
Okay. Let's pause for a minute. This is, by the way, a very important Hasidic thought that when I've taught this before, people were not particularly happy with. What's this first kind of tzaddik? What's this kind of argument?
That there is a tzaddik who only serves God, whose only desire is to be a servant of him, and who can change God's decrees based on his righteousness, I guess. So the tzaddik can, if God decrees to do something, I think it's kind of like when Moses, remember when God said he was going to destroy Israel and Moses intervened and God changed his mind.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
So his argument is the tzaddik, the rebbe, can do this by virtue of their own righteousness, their own servitude, their own dedication, their own spirituality, their own special connection with God and the spiritual world. The tzaddik has the ability to change God's mind and overrule what God wants in this world. This comes up quite surprisingly frequently, by the way, in Hasidic thought. They really like this verse of this section of Talmud. They quote it not infrequently. Yes, Margaret.
So what Tammy mentioned, there are a number of occasions when people argue with God and change in the Torah and change God's mind. So what makes this a particularly Hasidic sphere of or kind of thought when there are so many examples that it seems like any scholar could pick, any type of scholar could pick from the Torah.
Good. So let's actually break that down. Who are the people who do it? Who you think of who do this? Who change God's mind?
Well, trying to think. Abraham changes God's mind.
Good.
Who else?
Tammy mentioned Moses.
Tammy mentioned Moses. So you're going to point out that they're all tzaddiks because they're all such important people. Is that the training?
That was kind of the gist of where this was going to go. Yes,
Yeah,
that ultimately those people serve as models of what a tzaddik, who a tzaddik is and what a tzaddik should be. So it's not, and I think that's an important part in Hasidic thought, is that it's not, Hasidut is not particularly democratic. I mentioned last week, it's not like you vote for your Hasidic rebbe. It's not, and when he dies, it's not like you have an election to hire a new one. It's not like there's a search committee that comes out that gets put together and they bring it to the lawyer and say, who do you want to hire? That's not the way this worked. The rebbe would go out, would recruit people to him, and that would be the rebbe, and his children would become the rebbe after him. His sons, sorry, ladies. But we'll maybe talk about that when we get to Chaye Sarah a little bit. So it wasn't democratic, but the idea is, who is the rebbe? The rebbe is somebody who has the special spiritual connection, and by virtue of that special spiritual connection is able to do things that not everybody else can do.
But how do you prove that? And and I know, and like Moses was imperfect, okay? So like in human terms, in like today, I mean, how other than following the lineage, I mean, who else is a Hasidic lineage? Who else is a tzaddik? Because none of us are perfect. How do we know who has this like direct communication with God?
It's a good question. Part of me almost feels like there's a little bit of a televangelist aspect of it.
Yes.
Right? Like, and I don't think the televangelist, by the way, I don't think that's an accident either. I think it's pulling off kind of the same spiritual path, and well, I don't say path, same spiritual reasoning and needs of other people. But why do people love a televangelist? Because they say things, they're charismatic, and they can do things that don't seem like anybody else can do. So when you see the Rebbe coming up and praying very devoutly, and what they say comes to fruition, they must have that spiritual connection. It becomes a little bit of a circular argument, right? Like they're the Rebbe because they can do things, and they can do things because they're the Rebbe.
Rabbi.
I'm too cynical.
And so yes, I think there's a piece there where in terms of structure and that, I think that's something that I think a lot of us conservative liberal Jews struggle with, because we don't fall into that category. We're not seeking someone who can do miracles. We're not seeking someone who has a special connection with God. We're seeking someone who can guide us on our lives and help us in our times of need, and help us further our Jewish education and our Jewish journeys. So yes, and I want to say that I think what you're looking for and what most of us are looking for are not the same things as what the people that the rebbes, the Hasidic groups are targeting. Yes, Chad.
So people just accepted that the rabbi passed on all those phenomenal qualities to their sons. They just, through genetics, just got the same kind of skills.
Kind of,
believe.
yes. There is a Kabbalistic argument to be made here. I don't want to go too deep down the rabbit hole because it's a pretty deep hole. But one of the Kabbalistic concepts is that there are soul roots. There's kind of, or all souls have an origin in one of 6 places, who are typified by personalities from the Torah. And I think you could argue that, if the Hasidic line comes from this soul root, that the people on this soul root are going to be more inclined towards this kind of thing than others. And so their children will therefore also be more inclined. If that kind of answers your question.
Yeah.
Probably not super satisfactorily, but enough to understand where they're coming from.
I'm
Yeah.
sure there've got to be lots of stories of grumbling when the new Rebbe did not measure up to the old Rebbe too. So it's not like I think everyone just took it at face value and it had to be true, but
Yeah.
And on
I
a
have to look up
practical,
who tells the story. There's a story, there's a really fantastic story about an old rabbi who had led the congregation for over 50 years. And when he passed away, they decided to hire his son, who was a young rabbi at the time. And part of the reason they hired him is they said, it's his son. He's going to do things the same way his father did them, because that was his father and his teacher. And so, sure enough, soon after they hire the new rabbi, the son starts changing all sorts of things. He changes this, he changes that, he changes this, and they call him, they call him into the and say, Rabbi, what are you doing? Like, you're supposed to be like your father. How can you be so different? And he's like, what are you talking about? I'm just like my father. My father used his voice to say what was important to him. I'm using my voice to say what's important to me. I'm doing exactly what my father used to do.
and I guess also on a practical level, the sons would have been training.
Yes, on a
with
practical
their
level,
father.
Yeah.
you train under your,
Yeah.
your father is one of your primary teachers. You're training in his yeshivot, and in his schools, so you're probably learning what he wants you to learn. And there is a halakha about not disagreeing publicly with your father. So I mean, this does kind of work in some of those ways too. Yes.
And you would hope if the children are raised in his home, if he's such a tzaddik, then you would hope that the home environment would produce that kind of person too.
God willing.
We all know if we've had children, that does not always work.
That's true.
That's why I said God willing. Yes. So there are 2 kinds of tzaddikim, the Kedush HaLevi says. One is the tzaddik who, due to his great service to God, his urge to serve God, his great spiritual connection, can reverse God's decrees. That's number 1. Who's the second? Josh, if you want to continue, you can finish the thought.
Yeah, there is another kind of tzaddik who serves the blessing one, but sees himself as very, very lowly and thinks to himself, who am I that I should pray to annul the decree? Therefore, he doesn't pray to do so. If you want me to keep...
Thoughts, comments?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, those are two really good and contrasting versions of what it means to be holy. And I think it goes through other traditions even than ours, of the holiness of complete submission versus the holiness of sort of righteousness in action.
Good.
The tzaddik with low self-esteem. The tzaddik who is not
think it-
sure of his, who doesn't think he's worthy to serve, maybe,
Or who
or
just
ask.
sets his ego aside.
Yeah,
Who am I that I should change God's will? So
Okay.
I think there's a couple different ways you can read this. One of them is does he have the ability to change God's will? Yes. But he thinks to himself, who am I? I'm just a tzaddik. Who am I that I should change what God wants for this world? If this is God's will, who am I to change it? And so he doesn't. He doesn't try. He doesn't make an effort to change it. That's one way to read it. I think another way is there's a certain level of humility that you need as a leader. I think all of us can probably look at somebody we have seen in our lives, whether it's personal lives and businesses we worked at, if it's politically, if it's somewhere, we can look at somebody who really, historically, who really loved the idea of being in power and loved the power that they had so much that they become arrogant because of it. And to be a real tzaddik requires a certain level of humility, to keep yourself grounded, to keep yourself because if you don't, you're just going to keep elevating to the upper spheres of heaven and never actually have a connection with the people on the ground. And that's really what part of the being a tzaddik in the Hasidic thought is you're the channel, you're the conduit for the spiritual realm, for the people. You have this special ability, use it to bring God to these people. But to do that, you have to stay with the people. You can't go lofting off into heaven. You got to stay with them because otherwise you can't help them. You can't help somebody if you're elevating yourself so far above them. So there's a certain level of humility that's necessary. But there's a level of humility where there's a fine line between humility as a mitzvah, as an attribute, as a good thing, and where humility becomes a transgression. Where you become so humble, you say, I can't do anything because I'm awful, I'm worthless. Who am I? I'm nothing. I'm nobody. I can't do anything. I'm so humble that I can't do anything.
or arrogant about how humble you are.
Well, if you're arrogant about how humble you are, you're actually not humble.
Well,
I'd argue the other way.
okay.
But I think this is the opposite extreme. It's not like, oh, look how humble I am. I told the story on Yom Kippur, like, look who thinks he's nothing. There's an old joke. Do you guys know that joke? I taught it in my breakout session on Yom Kippur. I have a little time. I'll try to do it quickly. Is that, on Yom Kippur, the rabbi gets up in front of the open ark and says, the rabbi says, God, we are nothing before you. We're but dust and ashes. We can't do anything. Please forgive us for all of we do. And then the rabbi goes and sits back down. And the cantor stands up, goes in front of the ark and says, God, I'm even less than the rabbi is. we're nothing. Please forgive the people because we're all nothing and we don't know what we're doing. Please just forgive all of us because we're nothing. And so the cantor goes and stands by the rabbi, and the president of the congregation comes up and stands before the open ark, and the rabbi nudges the cantor and goes, look who thinks he's nothing. So that's a false sense of humility, right? That's the arrogance of look how humble I am because I need to stand up there and say how humble I am. This is the opposite. This is somebody whose humility they see themselves as awful because of their humility. They're so humble, they won't do the things that they need to do or that they're capable of doing because they think they're so lowly, awful, low, whatever.
Like an inferiority complex.
Kind of, yes. Like, I'm so inferior, I'm not capable of doing it when you really are. And I think that's a little bit of where the Kedushat Levi is putting Noah, is that Noah saw himself as so humble, and who was a tzaddik, but he was so humble that he said, if this is what God wants to happen, who am I to stop it? He could have stopped the flood, but he didn't let himself try because he didn't think he could do it. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I thought Noah tried to get the people. I mean, didn't he tell them at one point, God's going to destroy us, you need to change your behavior?
So it's interesting. I think there is a midrash somewhere where Noah does that, but it doesn't look like Rashi or others really follow that midrash. At least not Levi Yitzchak either. Do they know of that midrash? I can almost guarantee the answer is yes. They just don't seem to follow it. I would need to find it. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I think where both Rashi and Reb Levi Yitzchak are pulling from is this. There's a comparison to be had with Abraham. So when God says to Abraham, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, what does Abraham do?
He bargains with God.
How can you do that? You can't just destroy the innocent with the wicked. Mm-hmm. If there are innocent people there, you should be saving them, not destroying them. You can't do this. And Abraham negotiates with God. When God tells Noah, there's going to be a great flood and I'm going to wipe out everybody, what does Noah do?
He builds a boat.
He builds a boat. As he does exactly as God tells him to do and doesn't say a word. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where Rashi and Reb Levi Yitzchak are pulling from. Is to say, Abraham stuck up for the people. Noah, not so much. And I think Reb Levi Yitzchak's trying to understand why. Why is he why didn't he stand up? Why didn't he say anything?
So,
he's saying he didn't do it because he thought himself so humble that he didn't think he could do it.
This is totally making me see this in a totally different way.
Thank God. So let's kind of wrap it up and then we can kind of discuss from there. Somebody want to read the last paragraph?
I'll read it. Noah was a great and blameless tzaddik, but he was very small in his own eyes and did not have faith in himself that he was a tzaddik who ruled and could annul the decree. On the contrary, he saw himself like everyone else in his generation and would think, if I'm going to be saved in the ark, and I am no more righteous than anyone else in this generation, then they will also be saved. Therefore, he did not pray for the people of that generation. This is why Rashi interprets Noah was included among those of small faith.
Right? Like Noah thought, I'm just like everybody else. I'm just a regular old guy. But he wasn't. And you think, if I'm going to be saved, so will everybody else. So I don't really need to worry about it. Maybe that's why he doesn't get on the ark until the waters come, because he thinks maybe God's going to stop this before anything happens. As we read in like chapter 7, like it says that Noah didn't get on until the waters came. Maybe this is wise, because he thought, maybe I won't even have to get on the ark. Because I'm just a regular old, I'm just good old Joe, good old no man, you know. If I'm going to be saved, so will everybody else. But he didn't try to help anybody else. And the floods came after them anyway.
Yeah, so I have a problem calling him a tzaddik then. I mean, who am I to argue with Rashi? But
Who are you to argue with? The Torah said. The Torah is the one who says.
I mean, you know, usually I don't understand anything, but I do know what I think is right and wrong. And I always believe that it's incumbent upon each one of us to do what we can to help people, to save people. And it's so, in my opinion, if Noah were to say, not my job, it's going to be fine, he's not blameless. This is bothersome to me.
Well, one thing that, you know, it talks about how awful everybody was. And we don't really get it, at least not in the Torah portion, we don't really get much of a sense of how that developed and what was going on, except it just said everybody was evil. So maybe when he looked around and he saw all the stuff that was going on, he kind of agreed that that somehow a stop should be put to it.
But there would have had to have been, just like when Abraham negotiated for Sodom and Gomorrah, there would have had to have been innocence because there were children. I mean, everybody wasn't an adult, most likely. So yeah, I'm kind of like, yeah, he didn't, from this, it looks like he didn't step up to the plate, or he did not use his platform that he was given to try to, he kind of only thought, I'm thinking he kind of only thought about himself, because he didn't help other people build a boat. He just built a boat for himself and his family. So I don't know. I got a lot to think about now. Thank you, Rabbi.
So I'm trying to think, there's a few things that I'm trying to think of. One is, I think I mentioned a Midrash where Noah was trying to go around. I actually think I was mixing up the Midrash. The Midrash is Noah starts to build the boat and everybody else starts coming to him saying, what are you doing? And he says, I'm building a boat. And they go, why? He said, because the world is going to flood and I want to be safe. And they all think he's crazy. And they're like, that's not going to happen. And they all walk away thinking, crazy old Noah. If you ever saw the movie Evan Almighty, which is kind of loosely based on this, it's a similar concept where, Evan starts building this boat and everybody's like, crazy Evan. I don't know what he's so worried about. There's nothing to worry about. Just occurred to me, you could do a climate change. You could do a climate change sermon on this if you really wanted to, also on that Midrash, but we won't go there today. So I think there's a little, but nowhere does he try to save anybody else. And I think that's where this gets problematic. which I want to say, here's maybe the example I will give is, while I was in rabbinical school, a story broke about a former teacher of mine that I had in graduate school. To avoid Lashon Hara, I'm not going to give names or places. I'll just say I actually had a class with this guy. He's a brilliant person, fantastic halachic mind, was at one point the head of the Beit Din of the Orthodox Union. And so like really smart guy. And while I was in rabbinical school, news broke of he essentially lost a lot, because what he had done is he went on different internet platforms and discussion groups and forums under fake identities and started praising his own work. So he'd go on to like reform rabbi discussion groups, pretending to be a reform rabbi, and say like, have you seen the book that this guy just wrote? It's fantastic, and he has such great insight, and would kind of self-promote himself through these discussion groups, pretending to be other people. And he did it on all sorts of like dozens of groups and pages. And I know he got stripped of his position at the Orthodox Union. He lost his job as the senior rabbi at his congregation. I don't remember if he actually lost his job at the university, at the graduate school, but he got hit pretty hard because of it. And I remember that Rabbi Artson at Ziegler, Rabbi Brad Artson, used to do like a monthly Q&A with the rabbinical students. And so I asked him, I said, as his student of this guy, of this rabbi, what am I supposed to do now? Like, did I consider myself like one of his main students? No, the guy actually had no idea who I was. I introduced myself to him like 6 times. And every time I said, I had a class with you, he's like, oh, you did? It was awful. But I'm like, but I did learn Torah from him. I'm like, so what am I supposed to do with that Torah? And what Rabbi Artson said has kind of stuck with me, is that, we have to get to a place where we don't let one fault of a person destroy the entire person. And that the Torah you learned from him is still the Torah you learned from him, and it's still fine Torah, even if it's came from a tainted source. And I kind of want to say 2 things in relation to Noah. I think one is, I don't want to diminish who Noah was or his righteousness based on his, let's say, over-exaggerated humility. Should he have done more? I think that's what Reb Levi Yitzchak's arguing, is that he had the ability to do more and chose not to do it. So, yeah, he should have done something. But 2, I think this also, you can learn a lot from negative examples as you can from positive examples. So sometimes it's just as valuable to have someone show you what not to do in life than what is to show you what to do in life. And I think there's a lesson here for us as well. That we have the ability to do things. We have the ability to enact change in our world and in our relationships and in the people around us. But we can't be Noahs about it. We can't say, who am I to make change? Who am I to let anything happen? Who am I to, like, if this is the way the world is, this is the way the world is. What can I do about it? I'm but one person. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. And I think that's Reb Levi Yitzchak's argument here, is that if you really want to be a tzaddik, you can be righteous and still do nothing. But to really be the tzaddik that you're supposed to be, you actually have to step forward and engage and do the things. Even if you don't think you can do them, you still have to try to do it.
Mhm. I mean, also, I've got to say, it's like, I think it's easy to pick on Noah in this vein, but you also have to think that, one, who am I to stand up to God if God tells me I'm destroying the world, build an ark? It takes a special sort of person, and maybe the wrong sort of person, to stand up to God's orders because you don't like them. And Noah also did build an ark and gathered the animals. So
Yeah.
it's not like Noah sat there and was like, oh, God's talking to me, it will all work out. It was like he put in the work on his habitat home, essentially.
Yes, and I think that's part of his tzadikut, I guess it would be the noun form. His tzadikut also is that he did still do what he needed to do to preserve life. Could he have taken another step? Yes. And I think in the comparison with Abraham, it's noteworthy. Abraham still failed. Abraham negotiated with God, stood up for the people of Sodom, and it didn't matter, and they were still destroyed. But at least he gave it a shot. Noah defends himself, saves himself, thinking it's okay because if I'm saved, so will everybody else, but doesn't even try to save anybody else with it. Would it have mattered? Probably not.
Yeah, and I think it's also, just because it's not written in the Torah doesn't mean it's not part of the story, because it's very terse, especially here. We went from all creation to Noah in one chapter, and now we've got a chapter on Noah. So we don't really even know. It tells us.
Fair, it took 5 chapters to get to Noah. But...
yeah, but sorry, in the first Parsha.
Yes.
We go through Bereshit, and then we get to Noah in the second Parsha.
Yeah.
But it's also, we don't know everything that happened. It could be Noah did talk to God, and Noah, but the Torah doesn't want to belabor the point that every time God says something, you should argue with him. So we save that for Abraham.
Potentially. Look, one of the key concepts in rabbinic thought is that every word and every letter of the Torah is there for a purpose. One of my favorite little midrashic games that they like to play is there's a word in Hebrew called et. It's et. It has no translation in English. All it does is mark a definitive direct object. You can go back and look in it's getting late, so I'm not going to go into grammar of defining a definitive direct object. But that's all it does. That's the only grammatical use it has. It doesn't translate in English. But it's spelled Aleph Tav, which is the first and the last letter of the alphabet. So, the Kabbalists, they will say there's a whole world, there are worlds and worlds of meaning inside et, because it contains the entire alphabet. Even so, this word that has no translation has deep, profound, secret meanings that we need to dig out and understand. So the idea is kind of, if the Torah wanted us to know it, the Torah would have told us. If God wanted us to know that Noah had said something, that's kind of important information that the Torah would have told us.
Yeah, on the other hand, the Torah doesn't specifically say Noah didn't say anything either. So I think that cuts both ways. The Torah doesn't say Noah spoke of it no more and went and built an ark.
Correct. It doesn't, the silence is there. But that, there are other examples such as Cain and Abel, where the rabbis will expound a long dialogue between the two of them that doesn't exist in the Torah. So yes, it does cut both ways to some extent, and the rabbis can pick and choose how they're going to midrashicize. The proper Hebrew is drash, but anyway, they do choose a little bit, pick and choose a little bit how they do it. But I think the point is we can't know what we aren't told. So might have Noah said something, maybe, but we don't know that. So let's deal with what we actually do have in front of us and try to learn from what we have to be able to learn how to live our lives better from it. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
I just have a comment. It's just every time I go through and, we read the Torah over and over and over and over and over. And every time I go through, I see something else. And now I'm going to always see this every time I read this chapter, whereas before it just glanced over my head, it just went over my head. I didn't even pick up on it. But I was talking to Jonathan last week and I said, we were discussing something and I said, everything it doesn't say, the Torah never says anything for no reason. I go, there's always a reason, and we went from there. But yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Of course. I'm glad. And yes, that's why we read the Torah over and over and over again, because every time we do, we see something different that we might have missed last time, and we understand, and we're not the same people we were last time we read it. So we're more prepared to learn something this time that we might not have been ready to learn last year when we read it, or 3 years ago when we read this part. Downside of triennial cycle. But other questions, comments, thoughts?
Just this was very interesting. And thank you.
Excellent. So next week we'll be back. We'll do this again. We'll have to see who we're going to learn next week, but get ready for Abraham. So we're going to spend some time with Abraham starting next week. So looking forward to learning with y'all then.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you all very much for coming. Thanks.
Bye.
Be well, be healthy, and if I don't see you before then, Shabbat Shalom.
Safe week.
Take
Bye.
care, everybody.